everyone, I'm your host Sherry, and you are listening to From the Dark Side. I am back after a few weeks. I had a lot going on for the last month or so, including a much needed vacation. I just needed a break. But I'm back now, and my mind is fresh and flowing again, and I'm ready to talk some true crime. I have a ton of cases I'm ready to talk to you guys about, starting with a case out of New Orleans, Louisiana, also known as NOLA, a city rich with music and arts and culture. According to NewOrleans.com, New Orleans is offbeat, unusual, loud, and proud, all part of the gumbo that has simmered for 300 years. A city in a class of its own, New Orleans offers endless opportunities for fun and entertainment. I dedicate this one to my New Orleans friend Michelle, who doesn't like podcasts, so she will never listen to this, and that's totally okay. It's for her anyway. My sources are in the description area. This is episode 117, The Case of Addie Hall and Zack Bowen. This story took place in 2006. Blu-ray discs were available to the public. I feel like they didn't last very long, though. The top baby names were Emily and Jacob. Miss USA was Tara Connor from Kentucky. Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, died from an incident with a stingray. 424 astronomers deemed Pluto was not a real big boy planet. It was reclassified as a dwarf planet. And in ridiculous news, William Shatner auctioned off one of his kidney stones, and it sold for $25,000. However, the money was donated to Habitat for Humanity. As I mentioned, this story takes place in New Orleans in 2006. If you remember, just 1 year before, in August 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. This hurricane completely destroyed this city. Residents were warned to leave, but many couldn't. They didn't have the resources to leave, so they were stuck there. A total of 1,400 people died. It was a really awful time. I'll never forget it because it was my son's first day of kindergarten, and I remember going back home and watching the news, and it was just devastating. Today in 2024, there are still 705 people missing since Hurricane Katrina. Addie Hall and Zack Bowen were a couple who lived in New Orleans, and they rode the storm out and survived. On October 17, 2006, police received a call that a man had jumped from a building. The Omni Royal Orleans Hotel has a rooftop bar, and the man was up there having a few drinks before downing a final one. Then he jumped off the roof, and his body was located on top of a parking garage. They see this man as young, mid-20s, early 30s. He has a note in his pocket confessing to a crime. It reads that this suicide is not accidental. I had to take my own life because of the one I took. It also gives an address and says, send a patrol car out to this place. You'll see everything, including a full signed confession of everything I did. Zack Bowen is originally from Los Angeles. He was born May 15, 1978. At the time of our story, Zack is only 28 years old, but he had been through a lot in his life. He moved to New Orleans in the mid-90s. He got a job selling cups outside of the bars so that people could drink in between walking from bar to bar. That sounds like such a New Orleans thing. He met a woman named Lana when he was 18 and she was 28. He initially lied about his age, but he came clean eventually. They married and had 2 children together. And in 2000, Zack enlisted in the Army as a way to provide steady income for his wife and children. According to ABC News, Zack served in Kosovo and Iraq as a military policeman, earning several medals, including the NATO Medal and the Presidential Unit Citation, which is awarded to military units that have performed a heroic act in the face of an armed enemy. Zack's friends say that the military changed him. He had major PTSD. If you got him drinking, he would start talking about it. There was an incident in Iraq, they say, involving a young boy that he had befriended that weighed heavy on his mind and was a major trigger for him. Basically, he became good friends with a little boy there, and he would play with him and help teach him English. And then one day, the boy and his family were killed in a bombing, and this devastated Zack. For a while, his wife and family stayed with him in Germany. They lived on base with him. After Zack was discharged, he went back to New Orleans where he was hired as a bartender. He and his wife Lana eventually separate, but Zack continued to help co-parent their two children. Zack, they say, was depressed. His time in the military really amplified it. They say he was a completely different person when he came back to New Orleans. He was still charming and handsome, but very different and much more hardened. The other character in our story is Addie Hall. She was born January 15th, 1976. Addie had a very hard upbringing and dealt with several forms of abuse. Addie is 30 years old at the time of our story. She is originally from North Carolina, but moved to New Orleans away from her abuser. Addie works as a bartender at a bar in the French Quarter called the Spotted Cat. Addie is a poet, a seamstress, a dancer, and an artist. She is described as a free spirit, very hippie-like, but Addie had her share of demons as well from the amount of abuse in her former life. A friend brought Addie a Christmas tree for her apartment, and she burst into tears because she had never seen one in person before, and that is so sad. Addie was bipolar and known to have outbursts since she was unmedicated. When her lithium ran out, she was a completely different person. Addie was known to lash out at others when she was drinking. She also got into drugs and was known to be somewhat wild. She had lots and lots of friends. She rode her bike everywhere. That's what's great about living in the city. You don't even have to own a car. Addie and Zack began dating in 2005. Both being bartenders in New Orleans, their jobs were very similar. Zack was constantly hitting on Addie, but she makes him have to earn her attention. And he does after a while, and eventually they get together. These two kind of become the king and queen of New Orleans misfits, almost like the Joker and Harley Quinn, drinking and doing drugs together, partying and hanging outside on the porch with friends. They stood out everywhere they went, especially with Zack being 6'10" tall. That is really tall. I did read that Addie had a way of making sure police patrolled past her house frequently. When a cop drove by, she would pull up her shirt and flash them, so the cops drove by a couple times a day. Zack and Addie's friends say they had these knockdown, drag-out fights, screaming matches that seemed to go on forever, but other times they acted like they were deeply in love. Addie was shocked to eventually learn that Zack had been keeping a secret from her, that he had an ex-wife and two kids. I shouldn't say ex-wife because they were still technically married, even though they were separated. Addie's upset, but eventually learns to be okay with it. They hadn't been together very long when they get the news that Hurricane Katrina is coming their way. I don't know how much warning the residents of New Orleans were given, but they were all told, take the people in your house and flee the area. If you stay here, you may die. Zack's ex, Lana, even told Zack that he and his new girlfriend, Addie, could come stay with her so they would have somewhere to go when this hurricane hits. That's a super classy thing to do as an ex. She pleaded with Zack to evacuate, but he refused. Addie and Zack decided that they were going to stick around. They're going to hunker down in their apartment and ride the storm out. By the first night, the winds were over 100 miles per hour. They were actually photographed by a photographer and featured in the New York Times in an article about people who refused to leave before the hurricane. They were portrayed as these symbols of resilience and hope in a tragedy. The storm was devastating with 170-mile-an-hour winds. Then water breached the levees and flooded everything on top of days of heavy rain. I remember seeing national news footage of people sitting on their roofs holding signs, people looking for their missing loved ones. I watched one guy who had to go out and get his mother's casket that was floating down the street. It had come out of the ground along with a bunch of other caskets, and he had to go out and find it and grab it. Can you imagine? The aftermath was like a post-apocalyptic city. Zack and Addie were known to go outside in the early morning hours before the city woke up, and they would have sex in the middle of the street. This is totally post-apocalyptic. Zack and Addie would make meals for themselves and their friends, basically just throwing stuff together. They also stocked up on alcohol. They set up a campfire in the middle of the city street and cooked beans and hot dogs and ramen noodles. They built a small community in those weeks. Zack and Addie, both being bartenders, would make drinks for these folks in exchange for water and food. There wasn't any electricity or running water for weeks, so they had to make do with the supplies that they had. Once the hurricane was over and the city was cleaned up, they were back to their regular lives, which was a big problem for them. They were doing better during the storm. Now they have to go back to their regular lives and jobs, and they didn't want to do it. They both began using drugs and alcohol, and the fighting began again. I've heard similar stories of folks during the 2020 pandemic who were thriving and loving the isolation and unemployment and working from home. Then when the world reopened, it was hard to adjust from their new normal. Friends say Zack and Addie broke up and got back together so many times you didn't even know what they were. According to one source, Addie got so mad at Zack that she took his phone and left messages for every woman in his phone saying that he had AIDS, and then she deleted all of his contacts. Addie and Zack decided a fresh start was needed, and one day while walking through the French Quarter found a small apartment in downtown New Orleans. It's a very old building directly above a historic voodoo temple. The apartment was for rent for $750 a month, and they had enough money saved up to pay the security deposit. This apartment is very, very old. It's listed as a historic site in the city of New Orleans. During the move into this new apartment, Addie discovers something. She learns that Zack has been cheating on her. She decides this is the final straw and she's done. She's going to have Zack taken off the lease for the apartment. She tells the landlord that Zack has been cheating on her with another man and he needs to come off the lease. On October 5th, 2006, Zack discovers that Addie went to the landlord asking to have him removed from the lease. Zack knows this is bad because he spent most of his savings to help get into that apartment. If he can't live there, he's homeless. For the next few days, Addie is nowhere to be found. She stopped showing up for work. She wasn't seen sitting out front of the apartment talking to each person that walked by like she usually does. Her friends and people at the bar ask Zack, "Where's Addie?" He responds that she moved back to North Carolina to be with her family. This is strange because Addie loves New Orleans. She was kind of a local celebrity at this point. She wouldn't just abandon her friends without saying goodbye. However, Addie was unpredictable. You never really knew what her next move was. Friends had tried to reach her by phone, but it would just go to voicemail. Addie had this prepaid cell phone that you had to buy minutes for. A lot of times she forgot or didn't have money to buy minutes for her phone, so it wasn't completely out of the ordinary for her not to answer. The landlord was interviewed, and he said that the last time he saw Addie was on October 5th. She came to him with $750 rent and said her boyfriend had been cheating on her and she wanted him off the lease. He says Zack called him later and said Addie was kicking him out. Meanwhile, Zack is going around to bars and seems to be enjoying himself. Friends say he looked happier than he has been in a long time and was enjoying himself. 12 days after Addie disappeared, this is October 17th, 2006 at 8:30 p.m., police receive a call from the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel. They say a guy was there at the rooftop bar. He had a few drinks and paced around. He seemed odd. The bartender of this rooftop bar made sure to keep an eye on him because he was behaving so strangely he thought he might try to run out on his bill. I had to check this bar out myself online. Even though I'm terrified of heights, I thought it would still look like a nice place to be. The surveillance video from this bar showed the man walk to the edge and then walk away, then walk to the edge and walk away. He downs his drink, and then the man jumped off the rooftop bar and landed on the roof of a parking garage. He died a grisly death. He was found exactly how you'd picture someone who jumped and fell multiple stories. When the police arrive, they see this is a young 20-something handsome man sprawled across the roof of the parking garage. What the hell happened here? They also see his body is covered in cigarette burns, which we will later learn were self-inflicted. His army tags he was wearing on his neck showed his name was Zack Bowen. In his pocket, they found a baggie with a note along with a set of keys. The note read as follows: "This is not accidental. I had to take my own life to pay for the one I took. If you send a patrol out to 826 North Rampart, you will find the dismembered corpse of my girlfriend Addie in the oven, on the stove, and in the fridge, along with full documentation on the both of us and a full signed confession from myself. The keys in my right front pocket are for the gates. Zack Bowen." Police are dispatched immediately to Addie's apartment. The air was cool outside. The high had only been 81 degrees that day, but when they walked in, the air conditioning was set to 60 degrees. The apartment looked like something out of a horror movie. There's messages spray painted on the walls and the oven and the microwave. The walls read, "I love her. I'm a failure. Look in the oven," with an arrow pointing to it. He also spray painted the phone number of his ex, saying he loved her and he was a fuck up. They found Addie's journal that she wrote in, but the last few pages were written by Zack. He wrote, quote, "Today is Monday, October 16th, 2 o'clock a.m. I killed her at 1 o'clock a.m., Thursday, October 5th. I very calmly strangled her. It was very quick. Halfway through the task, I stopped and thought about what I was doing. The decision to halt the first idea and move to Plan B, which is the crime scene you are now in, came after a while. I scared myself not by the action of calmly strangling the woman I've loved for 1.5 years and then desecrating her body, but my entire lack of remorse. I've known for forever how horrible of a person I am, ask anyone, and I decided to quit my jobs and spend the $1,500 in cash I had. I had been happy until I killed myself, so that's what I did. Good food, good drugs, good strippers, good friends, and any loose ends I might have had. I didn't contact any of my family, so that'll explain the shock. I had a fantastic time living out my days. It's just about time now." The note was multiple pages, and most of it wasn't released. He also stated that you will see he has 28 cigarette burns. Each one represented a year of his life. Trigger warning for the next couple of minutes. We learned that Zack had strangled Addie. He then got extremely intoxicated and proceeded to allegedly have sex with her corpse before passing out next to her. Police will contest that last part. They say he didn't have sex with her corpse, but somehow it was leaked that he did. It depends on which media company is reporting. He didn't know what to do with her body, so he left her in their bed for a few days, and then he decided to dismember her in the bathtub. He then put her head in a pot on the stove. He put her hands and feet in another pot. Her arms and legs went into a roasting pan in the oven. Her torso was placed in a black trash bag and then stored in the refrigerator. We learn he did season these body parts. However, police believe this was to cover the smell. They found no evidence of cannibalism, even though lots of media outlets called him the Katrina cannibal. There's no proof that he ate any of her body parts. Everything was accounted for. Plus, his autopsy showed no evidence that he had consumed human remains. Why he chose to cook her was in his suicide letter. He was trying to separate the meat from the bones so he could dispose of her more easily. Before her head was placed in the pot on the stove, Zack cut off all of her hair. It took a while for Addie's remains to be tested, and DNA confirmed that they were indeed hers. They were cooked, so it was hard to identify. Police are 100% certain that Zack did this on his own. No one else was involved. You've got a signed confession letter. His DNA is all over the place. Zack acted alone. There's not going to be any trials or anything like that since Zack is deceased. This murder shocked everyone. This guy was a former military policeman, a war hero with several medals. We know he had a lot of PTSD from being in the military, but no one imagined he would resort to this level of violence. Many believe he was remorseful, although his note stated he wasn't remorseful. In his note, he also stated he was going to kill himself to pay for the life that he took. But first, he went around for 12 days and spent his last $1,500 on partying, drugs, and strippers. When he was down to his last dollar, he finished his drink and jumped off the rooftop bar. Some blame the fact that Zack and Addie's apartment was above a historic voodoo temple. However, locals say that's not what caused this to happen. They say voodoo is about healing and is a spiritual practice. Plus, the voodoo temple was ran by a well-respected voodoo priestess who wouldn't have had bad spirits around. I don't know enough about this subject to speak much on it, but locals who do have this knowledge say Addie's murder was not supernatural. It wasn't caused by dark spirits lingering around. She was violently killed by her boyfriend. A few years after Addie's murder, the building was occupied by a woman who calls herself Bloody Mary. Her real name is Mary Milan. She turned Addie's apartment and the former voodoo temple underneath into Bloody Mary's Haunted Museum and Tour. Yeah. So for $10.60, you can pay to take a tour of Addie's apartment. On the stove, you will see a shrine guests have created for her. They leave her money, cigarettes, bottles of Jägermeister, and other gifts. You can view the fridge where her torso was found. I know New Orleans honors their dead with pride and lots of passion. I know of some cultures who once a year dig up their loved ones and party with them. They dress them up and parade them around town. Mexico has Day of the Dead where they honor their loved ones who have passed as well. What I'm getting at is that some may not find this strange at all, that you can view Addie's apartment and where she was murdered. You can view the stove where her body parts were found. But this angered a lot of Addie and Zack's friends, especially because there's allegedly fake blood splattered all over the place. Plus, there's a set of male and female Chucky dolls that were placed in there. Yeah, that's a little odd. It's likened to a cheap slasher film at this point. However, there's a sign next to the dolls that reads that they were left as an offering, so I guess that makes it okay. The owner says that people are just jealous that they didn't think of the idea first. She also says she does this not to exploit Zack and Addie, but to pay tribute to them. I've checked out her tours online, and there's a lot of good reviews. People say she's respectful to their memory. I also didn't see any fake blood splattered anywhere. I did see the stove, and it was covered with offerings people have left, everything from Mardi Gras beads to money and cigarettes and candy. According to one article I read, people report seeing ghostly figures around 826 North Rampart Street. They say they feel as though they're being watched, and they hear whispers and feel a dark force surrounding the residents. A team of paranormal researchers went in there years later and said the apartment definitely has a presence. They even heard a voice that said, "Please don't hurt her." Many friends of the couple believe this was completely uncharacteristic of Zack. People still mourned him. They believe his untreated PTSD and Addie's temper are what sent him over the edge, almost like this murder wasn't his fault and that he was just as much of a victim as Addie was. Zack's mother said of her son that he lost his way after Iraq, and I'm sure it was PTSD. He was a sensitive soul and didn't know where to put all that hatred and ugliness from the war. His children loved him dearly and will never forget his kindness and love. So it is a sad thing what happened to my son. I miss him every day, and the world has lost a kind soul. There was a book published about this case called Shake the Devil Off, and the author got a lot of flack. The reviews stated that the author victim blamed a lot and that the book was more focused on Zack than it was on Addie. It's available on Amazon if you want to check it out yourself. A name that always comes up in this case is Margaret Sanchez. Margaret Sanchez was a young woman who was friends with Addie and Zack. During a documentary film about Addie's murder, Margaret was interviewed and she cried talking about her friends. Margaret actually did most of the narrating through the film. In 2012, this is 6 years after Addie's death, 28-year-old Margaret and her boyfriend go to a strip club on Bourbon Street in New Orleans. There they meet a beautiful 23-year-old dancer named Jaron Lockhart. They invite her back to their house for a more intimate performance and tell her that she'll be paid well for it. Jaren tells her coworkers that she's leaving so she can go make rent. She agrees, and once she's there, Margaret and her sex offender boyfriend kill and dismember her. They cut up Jaren's body and throw her body parts over a bridge and into the Mississippi River. Little by little, her body parts resurface and wash up on the shore. Police learned that she was last seen going to Margaret's house. She had died from a single stab wound to the chest, and for what? What did these two assholes gain from this? Margaret ended up getting sentenced to 40 years in prison. Her boyfriend got 2 life sentences. The reason his sentence was much harsher was because Louisiana has a habitual offender law, and this was his 4th felony offense. Anyway, it's super crazy that Margaret's friend Addie was killed and dismembered, and she talked about how horrible it was, and then she goes and does the same thing. However, it's not believed that Margaret had anything to do with Addie's murder, but it's just a strange coincidence, or maybe Margaret felt inspired by it. Addie's remains were taken back to her home state of North Carolina, where she is buried. She will remain a part of New Orleans history. She is remembered for her free spirit, her poetry, and just being a fun person who loved to be with fellow misfits. It's sad that she lived through Hurricane Katrina, only to die 1 year later. That's it for this week, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care, and much love to you all. Intro music is Feral Angel Waltz, which is composed by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons. All his music can be found on his website, incompetech.com.